The 1990s were fearless when it came to cartoons. Studios threw out rules, crossed lines, and aired shows that were equal parts wild and reckless. They didn't just test limits, they steamrolled right past them. But here's the question. How many of these cartoons would even survive on TV today? Spoiler: not many. From grotesque experiments to dark political parodies, let's look back at the shows that went too far, too fast, and would never get approved now. The Brothers Grunt, 1994. Ugly, grotesque, and unforgettable, The Brothers Grunt wasn't built to entertain. It was designed to disturb. Created by Danny Antonucci, who later gave us Ed, Ed, and Eddie, this bizarre MTV cartoon followed pale, muscle-bound humanoids searching for their missing brother. That's it. No heartwarming lessons, no clever punchlines, just shrieking, grunting, and surreal body horror served up as comedy. Even in the edgy world of 90s MTV, audiences recoiled. Critics called it unwatchable. Parents said it was nightmare fuel, and even teens, the target demographic, couldn't handle it. The grotesque animation and nonsensical storytelling pushed so hard against expectations that it backfired spectacularly. If this aired now, forget it. Modern networks wouldn't even consider a pilot this unsettling. Censorship boards would slam the brakes instantly, and streaming platforms would bury it under too weird to recommend. But that's exactly what makes it a relic worth remembering. The Brothers Grunt wasn't trying to be safe, funny, or even likable. It was trying to rebel, and it succeeded a little too well. Fish Police, 1992. Imagine The Simpsons, except underwater, and way more confusing. That was Fish Police, a short-lived CBS experiment based on a comic book. Picture trenchcoat-wearing fish, chain-smoking, cracking detective jokes, and battling mob bosses beneath the sea. Sounds surreal? It was. And that was the problem. The show landed smack in the middle of two worlds, too cheeky for kids, but not sharp enough for adults. Parents hated the wise-cracking gangster fish during family-friendly hours, while kids sat there baffled, wondering why cartoon guppies were making sly comments about shady deals. Today, this concept wouldn't stand a chance. A mainstream network wouldn't risk airing a show about crime-fighting fish who hang around smoky bars and flirt with trouble. But back then, CBS thought they'd found the next prime-time animated hit. Instead, it flopped after just 3 episodes. Fish Police remains a curiosity, proof that the 90s were willing to gamble on anything, even if it meant letting mobster minnows steal airtime. Would it fly today? Absolutely not. But in its failure, it helped predict the future of edgier cartoons aimed at grown-ups. Capital Critters, 1992. When the early 90s got serious, so did animation, or at least it tried. Capital Critters was ABC's attempt at political satire through talking animals. Picture mice, rats, and cockroaches living in the White House, debating issues like homelessness, violence, and social tensions. On paper, bold. In practice, confusing. Kids didn't get it. Parents didn't like it. Critics weren't impressed. Imagine flipping channels and seeing a mouse talk about heavy topics while a cockroach delivers one-liners about inequality. The result was audience whiplash. Too bleak for children, too watered down for adults, it pleased no one. Only 7 episodes made it to air before cancellation. And today, forget it. No network would gamble on using cartoon vermin to tackle problems that leave even live-action shows struggling for balance. It was ambitious, sure, but also misguided. Capital Critters stands as a strange reminder. Sometimes, cartoons that aim for big ideas collapse under their own weight. It wasn't charming, it wasn't entertaining, and it certainly wasn't ready for primetime kids' TV. Samurai Pizza Cats, 1996. What do you get when you import a Japanese anime, throw away the script, and wing it with totally new dialogue? Samurai Pizza Cats. That's not a joke. That's literally what happened. American distributors didn't have proper translations, so they wrote wild new lines filled with fourth-wall gags, political parodies, and random pop culture jokes. The result? A chaotic, self-mocking parody that kids loved and adults couldn't believe was airing. Cats in armor slinging pizza and jokes at breakneck speed, it was nonsense, but it was fun nonsense. Why wouldn't it air today? Studios are far more cautious now. They guard intellectual property, respect cultural accuracy, and avoid the anything-goes rewrites that Samurai Pizza Cats thrived on. What once passed as quirky humor would now be dissected for insensitivity or copyright headaches. Still, Samurai Pizza Cats is remembered with cult-like affection. It wasn't polished or careful, but it didn't need to be. It was an accidental masterpiece of chaos, and that chaos is exactly why it would never survive in today's climate. Biker Mice from Mars, 1993. After Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles became a cultural juggernaut, studios scrambled for their own mutant animal action hit. Enter Biker Mice from Mars, a loud, leather-jacketed trio of Martian mice on motorcycles, saving Earth from grotesque alien overlords. It was 90s excess in animated form. Explosions, one-liners, and chrome everywhere. Kids loved it. The toys flew off shelves, and the rock and roll theme song was unforgettable. But beneath the flashy surface, it was darker than Saturday mornings were used to. The villains, Plutarchians, were grotesque aliens obsessed with strip-mining Earth, a little too close to real corporate greed. Add in constant destruction, non-stop battles, and edgy biker attitudes, and it wasn't exactly family-safe fluff. Today, networks would hesitate at the tone alone. Parents who want gentle educational shows would revolt against a series built on roaring engines and city-wide explosions. It's the kind of show that feels more like a heavy metal music video than kids' programming. And yet, that's why Biker Mice remains iconic. It was raw, rebellious energy with zero apologies. Would it air now? Not a chance. But in the 90s, it captured something electric that can't be replicated. Exos Squad, 1993. What if your Saturday morning cartoon looked more like a war epic than a toy ad? That was Exos Squad. Marketed as just another action cartoon, it shocked audiences with serialized storytelling, political allegory, and an unapologetically dark tone. Instead of simple good versus evil, it introduced the Neo-Sapiens, genetically engineered beings rising against their human creators. Suddenly, kids were watching animated debates on oppression, freedom, and rebellion. This wasn't light entertainment. Episodes featured entire battles where characters didn't make it out alive, alliances torn apart by betrayal, and themes of prejudice and authoritarianism that went straight over children's heads. It was Star Wars meets Battlestar Galactica, but on TV before breakfast. Why wouldn't it air today? Because modern children's programming avoids this level of bleakness. Showing oppression, uprising, and moral gray areas is heavy enough for live-action dramas, let alone cartoons. Networks today would instantly call it too intense. Exo Squad didn't survive long. 2 seasons and it was gone, leaving behind a cult fandom that still praises it for daring to be different. In hindsight, it wasn't just another cartoon. It was one of the most ambitious risks animation ever took. Mighty Max, 1993. Toy-based cartoons were everywhere in the 90s, but none went as dark as Mighty Max. Based on miniature playsets, it could have been another forgettable tie-in. Instead, it gave kids a dose of horror they never saw coming. The show followed Max, a boy with a magical cap that let him travel through dimensions, guided by Norman the Viking and Virgil the Wise Owl. Sounds fun? Not quite. The adventures leaned hard into mythology, curses, and nightmare fuel. Villains weren't goofy, they were terrifying. Whole worlds crumbled, Characters fell to grim fates, and the finale ended in a haunting time loop that implied Max's victories were never permanent. Parents were uneasy, and rightfully so. For children's television, this was a heavy dose of doom and dread. It wasn't Saturday morning fluff. It was an apocalyptic saga dressed up with toys. If it aired today, no chance. The tone alone would spark complaints. But that's why it's remembered. Mighty Max proved even a toy line could stumble into brilliance. It wasn't about selling figures. It was about staring into the abyss, even if kids weren't ready for it. The Tick, 1994. Big, blue, and ridiculously clueless. The Tick wasn't your average superhero cartoon. It was a parody of the entire genre, poking fun at capes, tights, and larger-than-life villains while still celebrating the absurdity. With his booming voice and his anxious sidekick Arthur in a moth costume, the Tick skewered superhero cliches while serving up laugh-out-loud moments. But here's the catch. It didn't just poke fun at comic tropes. It went after trademarks, public figures, and anything the writers could slip past the censors. Villains like Chairface Chippendale. Yes, a man with a chair for a head, were both hilarious and surreal. Kids enjoyed the slapstick, but adults recognized the biting satire. In today's cautious climate, the Tick wouldn't survive. Studios are too protective of intellectual property, and parodying public figures this openly would be considered a legal risk. Add in the fourth wall jokes and corporate lampooning, and executives would shut it down before it aired. Still, the Tick remains iconic. It was an animated Deadpool before Deadpool existed, irreverent, wild, and impossible to replicate. It didn't just make fun of superheroes, it reminded us why we loved them in the first place. Street Sharks, 1994. Jawsome. That one word defined Street Sharks, the ultimate example of 90s excess. Four brothers transformed into half-human, half-shark creatures, chomping through concrete, tearing up city streets, and battling bizarre villains. It was clearly built to cash in on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles craze, but it leaned far harder into chaos. Kids loved it. The toys sold like wildfire, and the monstrous designs gave it playground buzz. But critics were not impressed. They called it one long commercial disguised as a cartoon. The show leaned heavily into destruction, non-stop action, and grotesque transformations that teetered closer to horror than comedy. Would it air now? Absolutely not. Today's networks are hyper-aware of shows that double as toy advertisements, especially when the visuals are this over-the-top. Watching sharkmen chew through pavement while explosions filled every frame would raise instant red flags. Yet despite its critics, Street Sharks carved out its place in 90s culture. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't clever, but it had raw energy, and sometimes that's enough to make a series unforgettable. Gargoyles, 1994. When Disney launched Gargoyles, audiences expected something cheerful. What they got was gothic, brooding, and Shakespearean. This wasn't a world of chipper ducks and silly sidekicks. It was the saga of ancient gargoyles cursed into stone, awakened in modern-day New York, and forced to fight for survival. The tone was dark, the visuals were moody, and the storylines were filled with betrayal, destiny, and prejudice. Characters wrestled with moral choices, relationships fractured. Villains were complex, and sometimes heroes weren't so heroic. For Disney, this was a bold departure. Parents were shocked. Some loved the maturity, others thought it was too intense for kids. Sword fights in thunderstorms, dramatic deaths, and themes of cultural identity were not what anyone expected from Saturday mornings. Today? A Disney cartoon with this level of gothic violence would spark endless debates. The same parents who once protested Power Rangers would sound alarms louder than ever. But here's the twist. Gargoyles is now considered one of Disney's boldest triumphs. It proved that animated stories could be dark, ambitious, and powerful. Cancel-worthy today? Probably. But in the 90s, it was lightning in a bottle. Animaniacs, 1993. If chaos had a soundtrack, it was Animaniacs. The Warner siblings, Yakko, Wakko, and Dot, burst out of their water tower armed with slapstick, satire, and an endless appetite for poking fun at everything. On the surface, it looked like zany, kid-friendly comedy. Underneath, it was razor-sharp parody aimed directly at Hollywood, politics, and pop culture. Kids adored the silliness, but adults quickly noticed the edge. The show roasted celebrities, parodied entire movie genres, and slipped in jokes so sly they flew over most young heads. Songs and sketches didn't just entertain, they mocked the very industries airing them. Would it air now? Not in the same way. Studios today are too cautious about lawsuits and cultural sensitivity. Mocking politicians or name-dropping stars with this much bite would set off alarms instantly. And some gags, once brushed off as cheeky, would now be dissected as inappropriate. Yet that's exactly why Animaniacs is remembered as untouchable. It proved cartoons could be silly and sophisticated at the same time. A reboot tried to capture that magic years later, but nothing could match the original's fearless wit. Too wild for today's climate, Animaniacs was lightning in a bottle, and it hit hard. Earthworm Jim, 1995. Only in the 90s could a worm in a robotic suit become a superhero. Earthworm Jim, based on the cult favorite video game, was equal parts absurd comedy and grotesque slapstick. Kids loved the wacky villains like Evil the Cat and Psy-Crow, while the show's surreal gags gave parents whiplash. The humor thrived on chaos. One second, Jim was saving the galaxy. The next, he was cracking jokes about pop culture or getting flattened in cartoonishly violent ways. The design leaned heavily into gross-out comedy, squashed worms, stretched bodies, and villains that looked ripped straight from a nightmare. Would it air today? Not a chance. The bizarre body humor, surreal violence, and anything-goes storytelling would be deemed too extreme for children's blocks. Networks now prefer polished, predictable adventures, not animated fever dreams where the main hero is literally a worm flung into danger every episode. But that's what made Earthworm Jim special. It didn't play it safe. It leaned into weirdness so hard it became unforgettable. It might not pass modern filters, but back then, it captured the essence of 90s experimental madness. Skeleton Warriors, 1994. Dark, brooding, and unapologetically creepy, Skeleton Warriors was a Saturday morning cartoon that looked more like a heavy metal album cover come to life. The premise? Baron Dark steals half a mystical crystal, gains the power to turn people into skeleton soldiers, and launches an undead army against the last human defenders. This wasn't playful fantasy. It was grim. Viewers saw grotesque transformations, blazing battles, and skeleton armies marching straight into nightmare territory. Parents raised concerns, critics called it too frightening, and toy sales tanked because even the merchandise was considered too scary for many kids. Today, a show like this would never clear the family-friendly filter. Networks avoid anything that leans too close to horror for children, and Skeleton Warriors leaned all the way in. It was violent, unsettling, and unwilling to soften its dark edge. But it also showed ambition. Skeleton Warriors wasn't trying to charm, it was trying to shock, and in that it succeeded. Cancel-worthy today? Absolutely. But in the 90s, it was proof that studios were willing to take risks that feel unimaginable. Now Freakazoid, 1995. Steven Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment delivered hits like Tiny Toon Adventures and Animaniacs, but Freakazoid was their strangest creation yet. The story followed a nerdy teen sucked into cyberspace who transformed into a blue-skinned, manic superhero. Instead of saving the world in heroic fashion, Freakazoid spent most episodes singing, mocking TV tropes, and breaking the fourth wall. Fans adored its surreal humor, but mainstream audiences didn't know what to make of it. Was it a superhero parody? A sketch comedy? A fever dream? Ratings floundered as parents complained about the chaotic pace and oddball jokes. Would it air today? Hardly. Its constant lampooning of public figures, pop culture, and even government agencies would be a minefield for modern standards. Studios shy away from parody this sharp, especially when it risks upsetting big-name brands. Still, Freakazoid has a cult following that treasures its weirdness. It wasn't made to fit a box, it was made to smash the box and laugh at the pieces. Too odd for today's cautious climate, but unforgettable for anyone who saw it. Freakazoid was pure animated chaos. King Arthur and the Knights of Justice, 1992. What happens when a football team gets zapped back in time to replace the missing Knights of the Round Table? You get King Arthur and the Knights of Justice, one of the most bizarre mashups of the decade. Led by quarterback Arthur King, the team was tasked with defending Camelot in magical armor against sorcerers and dragons. The result was as strange as it sounds. Kids tuned in for knights and monsters, but got constant football references that made no sense in medieval settings. Critics slammed the writing as clunky, while parents complained about the intensity of its battle scenes. Would it air now? Not likely. Networks today avoid shows that exist purely to push merchandise, especially when the premise is built on gimmickry. Football players in chainmail? That wouldn't survive a pitch meeting, let alone get greenlit for syndication. Still, King Arthur and the Knights of Justice is remembered for its sheer audacity. It wasn't clever or subtle, but it was proof that in the 90s, no idea was too weird to at least try. A time capsule of pure, over-the-top ambition, it could only have existed in that era. The Head, 1994. MTV's Oddities block was home to some of the weirdest cartoons ever put on television, and The Head takes the crown. The story followed Jim, an ordinary man whose head suddenly expanded to giant size because, plot twist, an alien moved in. Together, they tried to stop an invasion of Earth. This wasn't zany Saturday morning fun. It was dark, unsettling, and filled with grotesque imagery. Episodes mixed sci-fi horror with paranoid conspiracies, body transformations, and themes of identity that left audiences both intrigued and disturbed. Critics couldn't decide if it was genius or just too bizarre. Today, The Head would be considered way too much for mainstream animation. The grotesque visuals and horror-tinged storytelling wouldn't make it past kid-friendly standards, and networks would shy away from anything that risked being called too disturbing. And yet, The Head is remembered fondly by cult fans. It showed that cartoons didn't have to be colorful escapes. They could be strange, thought-provoking, and downright creepy. A daring experiment that could never be replicated now. Wildcats, 1994. Riding the comic book boom of the early 90s, Wildcats looked like the perfect bet. It was flashy, action-packed, and based on a hit Image Comics series. But while the comics leaned heavily into violence and dark storylines, the cartoon tried to sanitize everything for TV and ended up pleasing no one. The show featured covert operatives, alien wars, and plenty of laser battles, but the heart of the original story got lost in translation. Kids were left confused by stiff writing and shallow characters, while comic fans complained it had been stripped of its edge. Why wouldn't it air today? Because modern superhero cartoons are expected to be polished and emotionally layered. A watered-down, merchandise-driven adaptation, like Wildcats, would be shredded by critics and ignored by viewers. Its blend of heavy source material and hollow execution just wouldn't survive. Still, Wildcats remains a fascinating misfire, a reminder of when studios thought slapping spandex and muscles on Saturday morning TV guaranteed success. It didn't. And that's exactly why it wouldn't last today. Cow and Chicken 1997. If the 90s had a crown jewel of weirdness, it was Cow and Chicken. This Cartoon Network series followed two siblings, a dim-witted cow and her hyperactive brother, getting into surreal adventures. On the surface, it was just loud and goofy. But beneath the slapstick was some of the strangest, most questionable humor ever aimed at kids. The show leaned hard into gross-out gags. Characters shouted at the top of their lungs, butts were a constant punchline, and entire episodes seemed built around testing how far the network could push things. The supporting character roster was just as outrageous, with villains and side plots that felt like fever dreams. Parents complained almost immediately, calling the humor tasteless and inappropriate. Critics weren't much kinder. Yet kids couldn't stop watching, drawn in by the sheer chaos. It was funny because it was so ridiculous, but even back then, it raised eyebrows. Today, Cow and Chicken wouldn't stand a chance. Networks are far stricter about content, and a children's cartoon built on constant crude jokes would be pulled before it hit its second episode. The fact that it thrived in the 90s is proof of just how much the decade loved to push the envelope. Still, for better or worse, Cow and Chicken remains unforgettable. It's the kind of cartoon you can't quite believe existed, and the kind that could never, ever make it to air today. Invasion America, 1998. Leave it to Steven Spielberg to swing for the fences. Invasion America wasn't a wacky kids' cartoon. It was a primetime animated drama. The story followed David Carter, a teenager who discovered he was half human, half alien, destined to lead Earth against an invasion. The tone was cinematic, with serialized storytelling, heavy themes of war and loyalty, and visuals closer to a sci-fi film than a cartoon. It was bold, but it confused audiences. Kids found it too serious. Adults dismissed it as just a cartoon. Ratings tanked, and the show vanished after one season. Would it air today? Not likely. Primetime animation has narrowed to comedies, and networks wouldn't risk a serious animated sci-fi drama with this much violence and cost. The ambition was undeniable, but it was simply too far ahead of its time. Invasion America is remembered less as a failure and more as proof of what animation could be: serious, cinematic, and ambitious. But in today's market, it wouldn't stand a chance. Duckman 1994. Crude, cynical, and brilliantly sharp, Duckman was unlike anything else in the 90s. It followed a private detective who also happened to be a duck, except this wasn't kid-friendly comedy. Duckman was grumpy, sarcastic, and relentlessly satirical, tackling everything from politics to morality with biting wit. The animation was grimy, the tone unapologetically mean-spirited, and the humor often pushed right up against the edge of what was acceptable. Some loved it for its honesty. Others called it offensive. Either way, it left an impression. Today, Duckman wouldn't last long. Networks are far more cautious about politically incorrect humor and abrasive protagonists. A lead character designed to be unlikable simply wouldn't pass. But Duckman deserves credit. It proved animation could be brutally honest, not just colorful escapism. Cancel-worthy now? Probably. Groundbreaking then? Absolutely. The 90s didn't play it safe, and these cartoons prove it. They pushed boundaries, broke rules, and left us with shows so bold they'd be canceled before the first commercial break today. But that's exactly why we remember them. Which one shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts below. Hit subscribe for more deep dives into forgotten classics, and share this with a fellow 90s kid. After all, some relics deserve to be remembered, especially the ones that went too far.